World War II in the Pacific was fought under the most trying conditions, difficult terrain and extremes of climate. There were few more miserable battlegrounds anywhere in the world than the steaming jungles of disease-ridden New Guinea. The men who fought across the 1,500-mile-long island experienced war at its worst. There was always a good chance that a sniper might be concealed only a few yards away. In New Guinea, the Allied fighting man could never be certain that the enemy was in any one place. In Australia during 1942 and 43, the attention of everyone on that island continent was concentrated on the road back, a series of campaigns to be made by Allied forces under the overall command of General Douglas MacArthur.
When I landed on your soil, I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return. Tonight, I repeat those words. I shall return. Nothing is more certain than the ultimate reconquest and liberation from the enemy of those and adjacent lands.
By late 1943, the road back against the enemy lay principally along the northern coast of New Guinea, up the tail of the bird-shaped island. By December, U.S. Marines and soldiers had moved virtually all the way up the Solomon Islands chain. To westward, U.S. and Australian forces attacked the enemy in the Bismarck Archipelago area. On December 15th, the strategically situated island of New Britain was invaded. The assault was made by the Army's 112th Cavalry Regiment, 1,700 strong. The invasion craft were attacked by more than 30 Japanese planes. The invasion was carried out successfully, despite intense air activity over the landing beaches. The soldiers in the assault waves hadn't expected to be hit before reaching the beach. At Tarawa, for the first time in a combat operation, rockets were used to soften up the beaches. The landings were successfully achieved in spite of the heavy enemy air attack. And a beachhead was established. Attached to the 158th Infantry Regiment at Tarawa was a group of American Indians who were used chiefly as scouts. Stealthily seeking out enemy troop concentrations was a specialty of the Indians throughout the war in many Pacific battles. Ground forces officers came to appreciate how valuable the Indians were in their reconnaissance assignments. Silent and sure-footed, the Indian scouts went out on mission after mission behind the enemy lines. In a war which called for the employment of stealth and deception, the Indians were beating the enemy at his own game. In addition to serving as scouts and snipers, the Indians often functioned as couriers. They were most adept at carrying important messages safely through territory not yet completely won. In the South and Southwest Pacific, another small group of men called Coast Watchers played a major part in many Allied victories in that area. Coast Watchers were men who were thoroughly familiar with the territory held by the enemy. Top priority information on weather conditions and on the enemy's latest activities was gathered by these volunteers, who worked with the help of friendly natives behind enemy lines. Discovery, of course, would mean instant death. The Coast Watchers, most of whom were Australian, transmitted this vital information to the Allies by radio. After each transmission, the CW would usually be forced to change his location to circumvent discovery by the enemy. If the message got through successfully to Allied units in the area, an invasion force or air or naval strike group could move in on enemy targets more quickly and also cut down on their own casualties. In late December 1943, after the Tarawa diversion, a U.S. invasion was planned at another point on western New Britain, at Cape Gloucester. In a pre-invasion strike, U.S. 5th Air Force planes strafed enemy positions and dropped 400 tons of bombs on the beaches. The invasion was begun on the day after Christmas, 1943. The assault troops were 1st Division Marines. Most of the men in the assault waves were veterans of the long, bloody campaign fought by the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal. Commanded by Marine General William Rupertus, the troops went quickly about the business of launching the invasion. The scheduled plan for the assault on Cape Gloucester was executed successfully by the invasion force of Marines. Resistance was not expected to be heavy, but then no one could be entirely certain. The main landing was made on the east coast of Cape Gloucester. The beaches had been thoroughly softened up by pre-invasion bombardments, and enemy opposition was light, an unusual situation for marine assault waves in the Pacific in 1943. With the beachhead quickly seized, tanks came ashore, and the drive was on for the capture of the all-important airfield. Though the enemy wasn't particularly troublesome for the first few days, the great morass of mud slowed the Marine advance down. But the riflemen, working closely with the tanks, kept pushing inland without pause. The Marine tank crews handled their vehicles adroitly in the matted jungle, drawing praise from the Army. Every effective weapon was used against the dug-in enemy. After 22 days, the enemy was largely put to rout. The Marines carved up the disorganized clusters of enemy troops who hadn't fled toward Rabaul. The U.S. had succeeded to complete control of western New Britain. The enemy was fast losing his South Seas empire. The attack on Rabaul on the far eastern tip of New Britain was stepped up in early 1944. Thousands of tons of bombs were dropped on the enemy's one-time stronghold. In a 6-month campaign, U.S. planes knocked out Japan's most powerful base in the Southwest Pacific. Rabaul was rendered completely useless to the enemy. For the ground forces, there was one more important area in the Bismarck archipelago, the Admiralty Islands. The U.S. command decided that they must be taken. Before the actual invasion of the islands, a reconnaissance party went ashore on Los Negros to determine the enemy's strength. For 24 hours, they took stock and discovered that the island, seemingly deserted though it looked, was actually heavily garrisoned. It had been decided to assault Los Negros first and then invade Manus, the larger island. The GIs, who were experiencing their baptism of fire, headed toward shore on the morning of February 29th, 1944. Less than 24 U.S. planes appeared, owing to poor weather. The assault soldiers were expecting heavy resistance on the beaches. A good percentage of the GIs landed successfully, but once ashore, they found themselves in a furious battle against a determined enemy. It was a rough fight. In the campaign on the Admiralties, U.S. ground forces suffered some 1,200 casualties. Thanks to blood plasma and newly developed drugs, many of the men who had been badly wounded were saved. With the capture of the two principal islands in the Admiralties, the entire Bismarck area was sealed off. The U.S. forces now controlled the strategic airstrips, which had been used with great effectiveness by the enemy. The quickening offensive in New Guinea required the use of all available army divisions. General Frederick Irving sped the 24th on its way into combat.
You're about to embark on your great adventure, probably the greatest adventure that has occurred to you during your lifetime. It is the operation we've been looking forward to for a long time. We're all ready. Now, there are a few miscellaneous things that I want to mention tonight. First is, I want to prepare you mentally for the confusion of combat. If you keep quiet, the Jap does not know anything about you, but as soon as you fire your rifle, it's the same as saying, "Here I am." At the same time, you have little chance of hitting anybody in the dark. You have a big chance of hitting your own men. So keep that in mind. Firing at night, spasmodically and so forth, is a mark of ill-disciplined and untrained troops. I don't expect any of that in this division. In conclusion, I want to wish you the best of luck in this operation. These organizations have a grand reputation. I know that when the story of this war is written, that you'll have more than your share of the decorations and honors, and that there'll be no units, no combat team that will acquit themselves any better than will this combat team here.
The next jump in the leapfrog operation up the back of the New Guinea bird was to Aitape, some 400 miles westward. The offensive force was a powerful one, the largest fleet to support any landing in the Southwest Pacific Theater up to this point, accompanied an assault force of some 22,500 troops. A large proportion of the soldiers who were to make the invasion at Aitape were battle-wise veterans of earlier New Guinea engagements, like the men of the 163rd Infantry Regiment.
We'd been in a few scraps with the enemy on New Guinea, but nothing this big. This time it looked as though we were really going to throw a punch. was quite a show. The bombardment cheered us all up. The more those big guns pounded the beaches, the fewer Japs there would be to meet us when we went ashore. We started for the beach soon after dawn. We were all a little nervous, and that choppy sea didn't help that feeling in the pit of the stomach. Funny thing, but no matter how many combat landings you made, you never completely got over that case of nerves just before the battle. Once the shooting started on shore, the spell was usually broken, and you'd be so busy keeping on the alert that you wouldn't have time to be nervous.
The initial resistance to the landing at Aitape was relatively light, but as the battle progressed, U.S. forces were subsequently to cut off and chop up the enemy's entire 18th Army. At the same time, a larger U.S. force was landing some 125 miles farther west at Hollandia in Dutch New Guinea. Invasions were made at 2 points along the coast. Opposition on both beaches was light. The first phase of the attack was carried out according to plan. The men of the Army's 41st and 24th Divisions executed the operation without a hitch.
General, the first wave has landed on schedule and had no opposition. Swell. Couldn't be better. Thanks.
The plan called for the troops to drive quickly inland toward the 3 airfields, which were the principal objectives. In the ooze of the northern New Guinea coastal area, the troops were faced with a serious transportation problem. Now and then, the GIs encountered the enemy. But they offered no serious problem. With the 2 invasion forces linked up, the sought-after airfields in the Santani area fell to the U.S. after only 5 days. But it soon became apparent that because of the swampy terrain, the strips could not be built into major bases. A month later, U.S. forces moved 145 miles farther west along the Bird's Back. By seizing an area on the New Guinea coast at Toom, artillery could be employed to shell the real objective, the island of Wakta, 2 miles offshore. From the beachhead near Toom, assault troops launched the shore-to-shore invasion of Wakta Island. Spearhead of that assault was the 163rd Infantry Regiment, the same men who had landed at Aitape 3 weeks earlier.
For some reason, somebody decided that we had to have Wakta Island, probably because the airfield was a little better than the last ones we took. It was a short but tough battle. The enemy troops on Wakta were well dug in, and we had to use our most efficient weapons for getting at them and knocking them out of the battle. We killed almost 800 in the 2-day fight on Wakta.
8 days later, U.S. soldiers made still another landing at Biak, 180 miles westward in Gilvink Bay. Just before the landing, the rocket ships went to work. Rockets were proving more effective than naval gunfire in last-minute bombardments of the invasion beaches. The GIs of the 41st Division who made the assault on Biak were expecting a rough time once they arrived on shore. 12,000 men went ashore on Biak on that first day. 12 medium tanks were landed during the first 10 hours. The battle at Biak didn't get started in earnest until the U.S. force was well established ashore. U.S. Shermans were to play a responsible part in the Allied victory in the pitched battle. Biak turned into one of the most hotly contested engagements in the Southwest Pacific Theater. the enemy refused to surrender the island. 2.5 weeks after the battle on Biak began, General Robert L. Eichelberger was placed in command of the ground forces, with orders to bring the bloody fight to a successful conclusion. For the second time in New Guinea, General Eichelberger cleaned up a messy operation. In early July, another hop to Numfor Island carried the U.S. drive 80 miles still farther west. The small island in Gilvink Bay was invaded by some 7,000 GIs of the 158th Regimental Combat Team. The assault force expected to encounter heavy opposition on the only beach where a landing was feasible. But the initial beachhead was established quickly and with comparative ease. The U.S. invasion force outnumbered the enemy on Numfor by 3 or 4 to 1. Once more, the GIs were prepared for a grueling campaign. But the U.S. command had overestimated the enemy's strength on the island. Against light resistance, the GIs moved quickly across the island. But the command still expected trouble and called for reinforcements to be dropped by parachute over the recently seized airfield. The paratroopers making the jump were the men of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, most of them veterans of the drop on Natsap earlier in the New Guinea campaign. But this time, the operation was poorly executed. The troopers had been scheduled to drop a distance of at least 400 feet, but some were disgorged from the planes at heights as low as 175 feet. In addition, the planes should have flown in single file rather than two abreast. And the landing area chosen was so narrow that only a part of the group managed to land on the field. Many of the men missed the drop zone, some by a wide margin. Of the 739 men who made the initial jump at Numfor, almost 10% were casualties, and not related in any way to enemy action. Nevertheless, by the 5th day, all 3 airfields on Numfor were in U.S. possession, and all that was left was mopping up. Numfor was by no means the final objective in the New Guinea campaign. In late July, the next hop to Sansapor took the U.S. forces to the head of the New Guinea bird. The landing was not opposed, but the 20,000 GIs of the 6th Division were taking no chances. The assault was made against an enemy which was discovered to be in the process of evacuating the area. U.S. forces had succeeded in driving across the length of New Guinea to the very tip of the 1,500-mile-long island. In mid-September, U.S. soldiers invaded Morotai, an island in the Moluccas, lying between New Guinea and the Philippines. With this engagement, the New Guinea campaign was successfully concluded, a never-to-be-forgotten experience in the lives of the men who fought there, from the greenest private to General Eichelberger.
Historians will state that the 2-year fight for New Guinea was one of the toughest in modern warfare. I agree with them. The men who served under my command in New Guinea from 1942 until late 44 fought day and night under conditions which would have broken the spirit of less stout-hearted troops. Fighting on that terrain in that abominable climate and against an enemy as resourceful as the Japanese was tough enough, but the tropical diseases, malaria, dengue fever, scrub typhus, jungle rot, provided the finishing touches. The fact that we won that most vital island after some 20-odd months of dogged battling is a tribute to the fighting qualities of the American soldier. While my gratitude goes out to our brothers of the Navy and Air, as an infantry commander, I must say that New Guinea was a war of infantrymen, United States and Australia. And by virtue of our victory on New Guinea, the invasion of the Philippines was made possible.
While the leapfrogging hops were made in the Southwest Pacific, U.S. amphibious forces in the Central Pacific were engaged in their own campaign of island hopping. The Marianas were a most strategically important invasion target in June 1944.